Facebook provides a number of tools for working with apps. One of the coolest tools is the Graph API Explorer. It allows you to preview the data the API returns in JSON format. Let's take a look. If you've been following along with the exercises, we've seen that the data we receive from the API can be sent to the console. So if I go to the Develop menu and show Web Inspector, so if we open up this object that we output to the console, you can see all the data that we've gathered from the Facebook API. This is not exactly in JSON format. It has been interpreted for us. And this is actually a good way of visualizing the data. But sometimes you want to see, especially since we're talking about JSON itself, the raw data that comes from Facebook. To do that, we can use the Open Graph API Explorer. To find it, just go to the Developer section, and under the Tools section, if you're in the JavaScript SDK, is right underneath it. Just click on Tools and open up the Graph API Explorer. So when you run it, you'll see the basic user information that anyone can access about our account. So this is public data, the name of this user, first name, last name, and the link to their profile, plus their gender and their locale. Now, if we try to access some of this other data, you can see the connections that can be made to other types of data. Let's try to click on Family and see what happens. You'll see that it says that an access token is required to use this resource. So this is kind of interesting too. If you actually put this in a browser, you'll be able to get this to this data as well. So if we grab that number, and I'm going to open up a new tab. The URL is a little bit funky, graph.facebook.com. So graph.facebook.com, and I'll put a slash in that number. So this is actually our ID number. And as you can see, anybody can actually type that into a browser and get this user information about you, including your ID, first name, last name, and whatever you have made publicly available in your permissions and your profile. So Facebook is doing exactly this. It's actually sending a request to the graph. You can see this is graph.facebook.com, and retrieving the data, and it comes back in JSON format. So if we go back to the API Explorer and we switch over to our application, right now we only have one application, and it's this one right here. You'll see that it creates an access token. That's this security measure right here. It's just an encrypted piece of text that allows Facebook to make sure that this is a good request. We can see a lot more data. Scroll down here, because we have authorized this application to let us see a lot more data than we have. So now if we do something like go to albums, we'll be able to see the albums for this user. Now, still some of this data is not going to be available to us. Let's see, this activities might be just empty because the user didn't fill anything out. But if we try to click on add accounts, you can see that managing this requires extended permissions that we didn't ask for. So we could see the friends list. Doesn't really have anything. The user's feed. And notice how the Graph API URL also changes. So we can actually make calls within our application to the Facebook Graph API with these different URLs and get the data that we need for whichever part of the application we're working on. You also have the ability to do a get or a post or a delete command, so you can send different types of commands to the Graph API. And when you go through developing applications, you'll know that, let's go back to the developers. I'll just command click to create a new tab. A lot of times you'll be asked to do certain things like create a post or a get command to access different types of elements. So back to the JavaScript SDK here. So some of these functions, say fb.api, will perform some of those calls to the URL exactly like what we're doing in the Graph API and get a response. The response will be the JSON data in the format that we saw in the Graph API. So by taking a look at the Graph API, you can see the data that returns. By taking a look at this URL, you can see what you need to type in to the fb.api command. You just paste the URL right here, and then the response that you get will be that nicely JSON formatted data that we've been seeing so far. So if we go into our application, you could see that this console doesn't exactly give you the data in JSON format, but it's sometimes a little bit more useful because you know that if you need to get, say, the education of this user, you need to go to the object that you get back, the data, and then get an array. And right now, I guess this array only has one item. So we can get to this data in the exact same way that we would get to an array. So if I wanted to get to, say, the user's first degree here, the degree name, then we could do something like, and I'll switch back into BB Edit, scoot it over side by side. So if we wanted to print something else out, we could get to that same object by querying the Graph API with the me function that just gets the data for whichever user happens to be logged in at the moment. And then we type in education because it's the next node right here. And then the education is going to be an array. And we want the first item in the array, which is the 0th item. Don't get confused by this array1 thing. That just means that there's one object in that array. The index of the array is 0. So we have to type in education 0 dot, and then we just type in name, which is the next thing that we want. And then we can just hit save and go back into our app and reload. And it looks like we're undefined for some reason. So education, it should be education and then 0 and then object, the 0th object. And looks like I missed something. Let's go back into BB Edit, see how I wrote it. So info, education, and then it looks like I forgot I put name, but I didn't put the name of which thing that I want, which would be degree or school. Let's open up school here. School name. Okay, great. So I'll switch back here, and I just forgot the words school right here. School.name. Save that and refresh, and hopefully I got it right this time. And we get the school name for that particular user. So when you want to sort of visualize what the JSON data looks like so that you know how to get this, you can either use the console, just log in the object to the console. It's a little bit easier to read. If you want to see the raw data, you can use the API Explorer.